A very warm welcome to all of you to the conference. My name's Andy Smith. I'll just very quickly introduce the other people who've been involved in setting up the conference. This is Christian Hogsberg. For those of you who don't know him, it was Christian's idea initially to put this conference on, so very grateful to him for such a good thought. Dave Featherston is over there, my colleague from Human Geography, and Chris Gare at the back there from English Literature. Just want to introduce Christian again, who's going to chair the session with our first keynote speaker.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Andy. And it's my very great honour and privilege to chair this opening keynote session and to be able to introduce Robert Hill, who's a research professor of history at University California, Los Angeles, and one of very distinguished Caribbean scholars. He's going to address us on the subject of C.L.R. James and the moment of Beyond a Boundary. I came across a quote from John Arlott in 1971, who described Beyond a Boundary famously as perhaps the best book ever written on the game of cricket. But he also described it as an amalgam of autobiography, appreciation, observation, reportage, and most intensely a crystallization of a West Indian feeling for cricket. And really, we are very, very lucky to have Robert Hill. He was the director of the Marcus Garvey Papers Project, editor-in-chief of multi-volume Marcus Garvey and Universal Negro Improvement Association papers, as he's done monumental kind of archival work on Garvey, but also on other areas of Caribbean history, on edited a collection of Walter Rodney, Rastafari movement, and he's one of the authorities on C.L.R. James himself, most relevantly for us. He's a literary executor of the C.L.R. James estate and the editor of the C.L.R. James Archives series, with Duke, who's have a forthcoming special edition of Beyond a Boundary, I think coming out later this year. David Scott, editor journal Small Axe, once described Robert Hill as an archaeologist of black memory, someone who's devoted a scholarly lifetime to constructing and reconstructing the conditions of possibility for a public culture of black memory. And I think Beyond a Boundary is one of those works that remains so unexcavated, so much need for serious archaeological work and still to be done on Beyond a Boundary. It's one of the reasons I think why this conference is important as well, in terms of there remains so much more to be said, as well as celebrating James and his achievement there. And there's no real, I don't think, better person to tell us about and to explore some of the sort of dark, unfathomed caves of Beyond a Boundary than Robert Hill. So thank you very much. That's it.
Greetings. I am delighted to be here, and first would like to congratulate the organizers. It is a marvelous gathering and very important occasion, and it's my great honor to be able to join with you. When I first, I think, got the notice from Christian and saw that there was going to be a conference, I immediately shot off an email to Andy, and I think he might have found it a little bit presumptuous, but I asked him why was I not invited. And basically, years ago, I discovered a couple of things about the writing of Beyond the Boundary that I hadn't seen anywhere and commented on, and I felt, well, now I have an occasion to bring these forward and share them with you, and I'm going to do that today. I was at first trying to give a history of the writing of Beyond the Boundary, which is in itself a very complicated story. And I tried doing that, and then it just became too overwhelming, and I just threw it all out. And then I cut to the chase, if you will, of the two really important for me items. But then I thought, well, you need some history, so then I tried to bring the two back together. And that's what I'm going to do today. Beyond the Boundary is one of two bookends that frame the career of and the life of C.L.R. James. The second bookend, or rather the first one, is The Black Jacobins, published in 1938. Beyond the Boundary comes 25 years later, and this year is 50 years. So if we think in chronological chunks of time, these books sort of have a natural punctuation time-wise. I'd like to dedicate my comments and remarks to this brother, Stuart Hall. As I was preparing for this talk, I was often in conversation with Stuart, that is, mentally, internally, in conversation with him. I haven't spoken to him about what I'm going to say here, but I think those of you who are perceptive will at the end realize why he plays such a significant role in my thinking. In other words, these remarks are addressed to Stuart Hall, addressed to the career of Stuart Hall, as much as they are to C.L.R. James. C.L.R. James in the moment of Beyond the Boundary, 1953 to 1962. By moment, I mean a time pregnant with possibilities and a movement or movements that bring those possibilities to the fore. Those are the two senses in which I'm using the concept of moment. In the well-known preface, James says, the autobiographical framework shows the ideas more or less in the sequence that they developed in relation to the events, the facts, and the personalities which prompted them. If the ideas originated in the West Indies, it was only in England and in English life and history that I was able to track them down and test them. It was only in English life that I was able to track them down and test them. It is the tracking down of these ideas that I want to talk about this morning. What does that mean? James sort of takes it for granted that his meaning is self-evident. And as we shall see, it is far from self-evident. In fact, it rather impedes the exploration, the investigation, the interrogation, as people often say these days, of this text, because it's too final. It's too unproblematic. The ideas began in the West Indies. He comes to England, and it is here that he tracks them down and tests them. It's not at all clear to me that that is what happened. I would propose that we retire this formulation because it raises more problems, more questions than it answers. In 1963, James writes to Vidya Naipaul, without hammering in my chest, I have made it clear that it is my West Indian origins that gave me the premises and the impetus, though it was only in England and in English life and history that I was able to track them down to test them. James is clearly very wedded to this idea. One is reminded of the famous preface to the Black Jacobins, where James says, Toussaint L'Ouverture didn't make the revolution, it was the revolution that made Toussaint. And even that is not the whole truth. To this day, people still are mystified. Well, if that is not the whole truth, then what's the remaining part of the truth? I would say that what James formulates here in the preface is not the whole truth, and today I want to fill in the other part of this statement. In any case, James says, going back to the preface, to establish his own identity, Caliban, after 3 centuries, must himself pioneer into regions that Caesar never knew. Who is Caesar? It's not self-evident. In fact, I remember in the 1960s and 70s, the concept, particularly coming from a Rastafarian background, the Rastafari who refer to Caucasian men as Roman boys, has a certain malign quality to it. And for a long time I thought, well, this Caesar is obviously not a friend of Caliban, but who is Caesar? It's not self-evident who Caesar is. There are a number of candidates, but I would argue it is not a malign person who James has in mind. To complicate the story, I'm going to pose a statement that James made on June 1st, 1957. The Cricket Society gave a dinner at the Botanical Gardens in honor of the West Indies cricket team, who were at the time visiting England. And James makes a statement at this dinner from 1957. And here is what James says. I feel you English people should know, I feel closer to the West Indies in England than I have been since I left home 20 years ago. In other words, James has to come to England to feel this exquisite quality of West Indianness. In that sense, the ideas don't all originate in the West Indies. They come to maturity and fruition here in the UK. Now, from this collection, Cricket, the Great Ones, edited by John Arlott in 1967, James writes the chapter on George Headley, who we're going to see a lot of this morning. And James says, at the end of this chapter on George Headley, who was also a close friend, there is one point without which I would not like to conclude. As we wrestle with and probe into the development of West Indian cricket, what we shall find most certainly illuminate cricket and the cricketers who established the game before the West Indies learned it. So by probing and looking at West Indian cricket, James says, guess what? That probing, that investigation is going to bring us back to the home of cricket and will illuminate the origin of cricket here in the United Kingdom. In other words, whatever understanding James harvests in his study of West Indian cricket, he doesn't leave it out there in the West Indies. He says that understanding migrates back to the home of cricket. So this idea that you have this stark binary, the West Indies where the ideas began, and he tracks them down in the United Kingdom, certainly will not do. That kind of binary, that kind of stark dichotomy is static, much too final, and in a real sense, oversimplistic. I say let us retire it. It's an impediment to understanding how this book was written and what it means. James, in the same letter to Vidya Naipaul, says, the book is touched with implications of which I have become fully aware only after my recent stay of 5 years in the West Indies. I had finished it up to the end of chapter 17 in Europe, not having seen the West Indies for 26 years. James finished the manuscript before going out to the West Indies in April of 1958. Up to chapter 17 was done. What James writes in the West Indies is this section, Vox Populi, which is really less than 10% of the entire book. Up to chapter 17 is written in Europe. What the story of the writing of this book, the book was written in 3 separate places at 3 different times. And it is the pulling together of the results of these 3 moments that produces this book. The first moment the first 4 chapters, down to the light and the dark, are written at a tremendous burst, with a tremendous burst of energy. And then there's a long pause. A major set of events intervene to distract James away, and the 4 chapters are put aside. Those 4 chapters are written in England. Then James resumes the work in January of 1958, and in the longest piece of writing, he finishes the next 13 chapters. And then he's distracted by an invitation from Eric Williams to come to Trinidad for the opening of the federal parliament of what would turn out to be the aborted West Indies Federation. And it is out in Trinidad, in the West Indies, that James writes the section entitled Vox Populi, between June of 1960, when he splits from Williams, has that great political split, and December of 1961, when he gives the manuscript to George Lamming, and George Lamming becomes really the person, the literary agent acting on behalf of C.L.R. James. So there are 3 separate moments when this book is composed. I wonder if anybody here knows how it got started. It got started in the late summer of 1956. And it was prompted by a letter from a man who was a good friend of C.L.R. James. This man, L.E.S. Gutteridge, the man who was one of the important contributors to Wisden, the Bible of cricket. And Gutteridge had visited James. In fact, Gutteridge was the librarian of the Cricket Society. And he has an evening with James in London at James's home. And he then writes a letter returning the favor to James and saying, if you would like to do a little slumming, he calls it, my wife and I, we'd love to invite you to come over and visit us. And then this is where the idea for the book began. Gutteridge tells him, there are 2 matters that I would like you to consider. One is that we are having a debate about the Australian tour on Tuesday, the 12th of March, which would be March 1957. The members insist that you are to take part in it. The other is a matter about which you may care to think. A history of cricket in the West Indies and of the various tours has never been written. You are the obvious person to write it. It was this letter from Gutteridge that prompts James to really come to grips with the idea of writing this book. Now, James had been at work on other books about cricket. No one of them had ever come to fruition. This is the only James book on cricket that reached fulfillment. But what is more important about Gutteridge's letter, and the thing that inspires Gutteridge to make the proposal, is the visit of the West Indies cricket team to England in 1957. You see, when Gutteridge is writing to James in July of 56, plans are afoot to receive the visiting West Indies cricket team the following spring of 57. And what prompts James to embark upon the writing of Beyond the Boundary is the idea to have the book ready in time for the visit of the West Indies team. Now, this visit will be very important. The English press are agog with excitement. They speak about a whiff of the West Indies at Edgbaston. It's almost as if they want to touch them. This is a photograph of the team in England in the summer of 57. They looked so wonderful and young. You will recognize many of the individuals. But this 1957 team is notable For James in particular, because it's the first time he's going to see the famous 3 W's at the wicket. Now look at those photographs. What extraordinary poetry they display. This is the famous left arm spin bowler, Alfred Valentine, and the brilliant young Collie Smith. Here is Collie at the crease. This 1957 visiting West Indian team, that is what prompts James to put pen to paper, partly to receive them, but partly to take advantage of the moment. This is going to be interrupted by the outbreak in October of 56 of the Hungarian Revolution, and James puts the writing aside because he has to attend. This event is the ultimate political vindication of C.L.R. James's whole political philosophy. The other thing that prompts the delay in the writing of the book and serves as another distraction is the independence of Ghana. And Nkrumah writes to James in January of 57 and invites James to come to Ghana to be part of the celebration of Ghanaian independence. And Richard Nixon and his wife are out there, the Duchess of Kent, and Martin Luther King Jr. James is one of the dignitaries invited to Ghana. But you see, the independence of Ghana is March the 6th. James spends 3 weeks out there, comes back, and I don't know how he finds the energy to do it, but he produces the first set of chapters, which I have to say I have only just found a week ago, of the manuscript. And here's what James says to his American comrades about it. Now try to follow me as closely as possible while I deal with the concrete demonstration, the cricket book. That's the genesis. You have seen the reception which is getting from everyone. Men who have studied cricket all their lives and read everything repeat incessantly, "We have never heard anything like this." Now listen to the chapters of the general movement. This is James writing. The first 2 or 3 chapters deal with my early childhood. I give Neff a challenge. Neff is Lyman Payne, the man who is probably the greatest financial contributor to James's upkeep here in Britain. I give Neff a challenge, a stupid one, but I am ever ready to make it. I defy him to read those first 3 chapters without, at a certain stage, being moved to tears. James is writing about his own manuscript. My theme is my upbringing with English literature, cricket, and Puritanism. It's very important you keep that trinity in mind, because as we will see, that has its roots in another tributary feeding into Beyond the Boundary. These are the 3 fundamental characteristics of English middle-class society. I shall show, first of all, that precisely because they were not native to the West Indies, they assumed a reality for me that placed me in violent contrast with the people among whom I lived. Lamming tells me that it was worse in Barbados, of course. My mother and my aunts were Puritans of the deepest dye. I show the interconnections between these 3 to show how British the literature, the cricket, and the Puritanism are. By cricket, I mean not only the game, but the code connected with it. It is not cricket, it's a very serious business and not a joke. Now, this is James rehearsing the first 4 chapters of what he's written and what he proposes to write. And that's March of 1957. Remember now, this book is only published in March of 1963, and it is March of 57 that James is writing his own commentary. And these are samples of the manuscript I found last week. Now, as a result of the Hungarian Revolution, James's political organization in the US determined that they have to put forth a manifesto of their whole entire political philosophy. And James spends the rest of 1957 working with Grace Lee Boggs and Cornelius Castoriadis of the Socialisme au Barbarie group in Paris, and they finish what the book that would be published under the title Facing Reality. James leaves London the night or the morning after he has put the last set of changes into the manuscript. And James says, I have to get away from England. I have to get away from politics if I'm to finish the book on cricket. Where does James go? James goes to Spain, to Algeciras in Andalusia. And he holds up in Andalusia from January the 16th to April the 15th. And this is where 13 chapters of the book are finished in Algeciras. This is the second longer installment. In fact, by far the longest installment of the three phases of the writing of the book. And James is invited to return to Trinidad, where he hasn't been for 26 years. And this is a photograph of C.L.R. speaking on a P&M platform in Trinidad. James is in the West Indies from April 1958 to April of 1962. It is here, somewhere between June of 1960, when the political break with Eric Williams comes, and December of 1961, that James writes the third and final section of the book. George Lamming, as I say, served as the literary agent of the manuscript. And this is a letter from John Arlott, James's good friend, to James in December of 1960, in which he tells James, "My dear C.L.R. J, alas, I am sorry to have to return your typescript. We are posting it to Mr. Lamming." Lamming is the one who is circulating the manuscript. As many of you know, it is George Lamming who retitled the manuscript and came up with the title Beyond the Boundary. James had called the book Who Only Cricket Know. I'm afraid that is pretty much where we are still, where this book is concerned. Because what I've been describing to you, none of this is really very well known. The intricate moments and passages through which the different sections of the manuscript emerged, much of this is not known. But as we will see in the next few minutes, there's even something more hidden. The manuscript is finally accepted by Robert Lusty of the Hutchinson Group. And Lusty writes to George Lamming in May of 1961, "My dear Lamming, a brief note to say that we are much taken with James's book and have today written to him putting up a proposition for his manuscript." So finally, in May of 1961, James gets the good news. Hutchinson putting up a contract for the publication. Let's now go back in time. What I've given you is a kind of reprise of the historical passage of the manuscript. This is a photograph of James's INS, Immigration and Naturalization Service photograph. This is when he's apprehended here in America and declared an illegal immigrant. James decides on his own that rather than be deported, he will voluntarily deport himself. And this is the passenger manifest of the ship in July 11th, 1953, of James's return to Britain from the United States. And this is his entry here. James Cyril, age 52, care of American Express, writer and lecturer. And this is the ship that brings James back to England in 1953. In October of 1953, he publishes in the Manchester Guardian this essay called The Return of a Wanderer. Comparisons of the game of cricket when he leaves England in 38 and returns in 53. Then in January of 1954 now, he writes to his political comrades in the US a letter addressed to Grace Lee Boggs. Here's what James says. I have to report that Stephen Spender and Irving Kristol sent me number 5 of Encounter, an advance copy. You wouldn't believe it, but there is an article in it on sport and the social artistic significance of sport. The same goddamn thing that I'm going to write my chapter on for Encounter. James didn't like Irving Kristol. Irving Kristol was an old ex-Trotskyist and an awful man. And James took every opportunity to slam Kristol. But here's what James says. The man, as is usual with these fellas, goes halfway. He does not lay sufficient stress on the game. What language is to poetry? See, that's the first clue. James is associating the way you look at the game of cricket akin to the way that you read language. Keep that in mind. He does not understand either the full social implications, but the thing is there. If you look also in the essay of the Times Literary Supplement on English, you will see the paragraph on cricket and association football. They are all finding their way towards breaking down the barriers between what seem to be culture and aesthetics and popular sport, between the analysis of society and literature and the analysis of sport. They are feeling their way towards this. But James is watching them. See, James has already an advanced conception of how all these things interconnect. They are aware of the mass, but they do not understand the mass. It takes a lot of years and hard work to understand the masses of the people. That is where we are at the present. 2 months later, in March of 54, James says, writing to his American comrades, my plan was of extreme simplicity, to spend a year using the bourgeoisie establishing our ideas and making them pay for it. You have no idea of the impact of our ideas here. And in this, the writing on sport was of profound importance in addition to other lectures. Now, I want to emphasize that although James has in mind developing this conception of the social aesthetic significance of sport, it is not yet sport as cricket. It's about sport sui generis. Of 1956, the month of March of 1956, he sends to America a report, and he says, here are the books I'm engaged on. Preface to Criticism, Great Art and Literature and the Proletariat. B. Mariners, written for the British public. That's his book on Herman Melville. Mariners, Renegades and Castaways. And then a book on cricket, but in reality on the proletariat and its attitude to sport. Later will come another book on politics and the Vanguard Party. Very important is another book, a working woman describing the life of herself and her friends and associates in the US with comparisons with English life. No such book, he means, exists. I know that. This would become Selma James's book on the question of women. Now, put all this together. See, this is what I'm talking about when I use the concept of moment. A time pregnant with possibilities and the movements that bring these possibilities about, bring them to the surface. A book on great art and literature, a rewriting of his literary masterpiece on Melville, a book on cricket, a book on politics and the Vanguard Party, and then a book on working women in the US. All of these things form integral parts of the moment of James's conception of a book on cricket. In 1957, January the 1st, he writes again to America. As you know, I have been working on the book on sport, the preface to criticism, and the question of the party. They all flow together. At the back of it is my conception of the necessity of working out what it is that the masses of people want from life and what it is that they are able to contribute. I believe in time we shall be able to understand what this means in politics and socially, but as I say, it requires a vast effort. Now, one of the first things that happens to James when he comes to England in July of 1953 is that he reconnects with the great George Headley. And James would write in 1967, he, Headley, came to England in 1933, which is where James first met Headley. West Indies played 3 tests. Headley made 50 in the first at Lord's, 169 not out at Old Trafford, and before he could get going at the Oval in the 3rd test, he was stretched out flat on the turf. In the same essay of 1967, James says of Headley, "For when all allowances are made for qualitative individuality, for historical idiosyncrasy, we still remain face to face with a miracle." That's a photograph of George Headley at the crease at Lord's. And now I want us to play a video of the great George Headley.
Any true and lasting impact by the newer test-playing countries had to await the years following the Second World War. Nevertheless, there were quality batsmen from those countries, and none carried a heavier burden so independently and successfully as Jamaica's George Headley. In England and Australia, they called this wonderful little batsman the Black Bradman. At home in the Caribbean, they tended to think of Bradman as the White Headley. He was the first to invalidate the old credo that white man bat, black man bowl. And despite the flow of batting talent to emerge from West Indian territory since the war, Headley, the brave and inventive boy from Panama, still stands alone. Clifford Roach, on the right here, scored the first century in Test cricket for West Indies, and his partner, Ivan Burrow, scored the first for West Indies in England at Manchester in 1933. But one West Indian batsman stands out as the most exciting all-round cricketer of the period, perhaps of all time. Leary Constantine, fast bowler, electric-heeled fielder, batsman who could swing the course of a match in half an hour's frantic stroke play.
When you watch that man Headley, I knew him. He was my coach as a youngster. And I didn't realize, because I was young, how important George Headley was. What I do remember is that all of his physical being just seemed to move on another level. He just seemed so coordinated. And this is the man that C.L.R. James would now become very close to. In the chapter of Beyond the Boundary on Headley, James entitles the chapter, George Headley, Nascitur non fight, born, not made. In other words, to watch George Headley at the crease, as James says, is to be looking at a miracle. You can't explain this. This is the team that came to England in 1933, and this is Headley there. And that's when he is introduced by his good friend, Leary Constantine, to Headley. That's James's friend. Now, as the commentator said, there is only one other batsman who could rival George Headley for the number 1 spot as the greatest batsman at the crease, and that is the great Don Bradman. But most people say Bradman didn't have the vocabulary of strokes that George Headley had. And secondly, they call Headley Atlas because he never had another great batsman to pair with him. Headley was the only outstanding batsman playing for the West Indies, and he carried the whole West Indies team. In November of 1953, James writes to America to say, in between the last few days, I have managed to do some 20,000 words on George Headley's book. Behind it all is the communication with all of you over there. I hope in the course of the next few days to go out for 3 or 4 days somewhere and gather up some strength to finish off the preface to criticism. And when that is finished, I'm really going to take a good rest. Good luck. James was always promising to take a good rest. Never seemed to be able to do it. He has finished 20,000 words on George Headley's book. And later that month, on November the 30th, 1953, he writes again to America, I have done some 20,000 words on George Headley's book in the last few days, and I'm shaking in the hand. But there are a few things I want to jot down. Please note this. We must not forget the nature of a new culture. We indicate it somewhere. It is not intellectual and manual split, so they are joined, a form of total activity of all faculties. Now we're in the following month, December of 1953, and this is James wearing out his right hand. He writes to America to say, I shall spend today clearing up as much as I can. Constantine is sitting next to me working on George Headley's book and will be here all day. But I shall try to do what I can. Now, picture this. Constantine is seated, going over the draft manuscript of the Headley book. James writes a letter, count them, of 53 pages, foolscap, legal size. And Constantine is working next to him. Constantine then tells James, if I give him the biography in 2 or 3 months, he can guarantee at least £170 as an advance. It has been a long day, he says. Constantine has come and gone. The chapters are reviewed, and I have to revise them and get them typed. Then he will take them to the publisher. The writing of the book that James is engaged in on George Headley is what I call the seasoning process of Beyond the Boundary. Beyond the Boundary is really to be found, the seed of it, in the biography of George Headley from 1953 to 54, at the same time that James is writing Preface to Criticism on Great Art and Literature and the Proletariat. In other words, you cannot understand how James came, the approach he developed to cricket, if you don't recognize, and it's possible, not to recognize the centrality of the work on George Headley. This is another long letter to America. There are literally thousands of these letters that flowed back and forth. James is a kind of one-man bureau, keeping several typists and secretaries going all at once. James writes to tell them, as for the cricket, Headley and Constantine are simmering with excitement at what I propose. Nothing less is involved than an attack on the whole method of first-class play in England. They have worked it out technically. They say it is wrong, and they say why. If you read my article, the article we saw, The Return of a Wanderer, you will see that I saw it within 2 weeks of watching here. Their ideas needed historical and theoretical organization. I have done it, and I am ready to launch a sociological revaluation of the game that is as distinctive and radical as our ideas on society and literature. That's what I mean by moment. a time pregnant with possibilities and a movement to then bring those possibilities to the surface. Now, here is another listing. James was famous for making lists of the things he's working on. Kenya pamphlet to be finished in 4 weeks, beginning Monday, March 20th. That's the book, The People of Kenya Speak for Themselves, by the Kenyan Mbuyu Koinange, that James wrote. Preface to Mariners, Renegades, Castaways, Milton from Preface to be submitted, Hamlet and Lear from Preface to be submitted to the London Magazine, revision of 50,000 words of the translation of Daniel Guérin's French Revolution. Now, James also notes, I would prefer to come back home and go to Droitwich, where I would be near to George Headley and be able to talk to him. Now, this is what I'm going to show you is the manuscript of the book on George Headley. James only got 2 chapters done. James says, the following criticism of cricket books from the Times Literary Supplement of August 21, 1948 is relevant to the consideration of the manuscript which follows and the plan for completion. This is the manuscript. He has lined up Neville Cardus to write the introduction. The completed book will be as follows. Introduction by Neville Cardus, chapter 1 through chapter 8, and that's the first chapter, and that's the young batsman George Headley, my tough apprenticeship. And then this is the second chapter, chapter 8, on batting. In February of 54, James is able to send to George Headley, here is the manuscript. A copy has gone to Leary for him to take to the publishers. Headley writes back to James, Dear Nello, I'm looking through the script. And he concludes, see you soon, Topper, chapter 8, certainly a classic. I stress again, the genesis of Beyond the Boundary is to be found in this work that James did, a work of collaboration with George Headley. Now, here in Britain, James is going about meeting all kinds of people and talking to them. And one of them that he goes to meet 2 years before he dies is C.B. Fry. C.B. Fry was a great all-round athlete and writer. James calls C.B. Fry in Beyond the Boundary his hero. And he says, I spoke to him about the Olympic Games of Greece and also what I call the aesthetics of cricket. He asked me to come back to see him again. You can see Fry thinking, this Negro is crazy. He said that he had never seen this subject treated anywhere. For me, or I should say for us, the fundamental question of the aesthetics of the game is rooted in the working class as audience and the change in British society towards popular democracy in the middle of the 19th century. These are the local enjoyments that correspond to the local grievances which you all in Detroit so painfully neglected until I brought them to your attention. It is here, along these lines, that the battle is to be fought. This is a different conception of the use of Marxism. These are photographs of C.B. Fry, and here is an interlude for some gossip, but serious gossip. 1953, Dear Grace and William, and whom it may concern, I'm going on quietly and peacefully. Meanwhile, I send you some gossip. I sometimes go out with a radio and television actress. The same girl told me one day, as if out of the blue, that William Empson lived near to me, and why didn't I go to see him? I was not paying too careful attention to what she was saying. I found it rather strange and let it slide. I had missed something. But then the other evening, we were walking along Belsize Park or road or something quite near to me, and she shouted, there is Smith and the Empsons. Exactly. William Empson himself, the great ambiguity. It seems that he and his young fellow are as thick as thieves, and once more it is obvious that I should get together with Smith and maybe the acquaintance, and we should have some sort of get-together. James goes into a whole discussion of the foolishness of these literary critics in Britain. But the one man that James had the deepest, most profound respect for is this one. And that's the point I want to stress here today. James was fascinated with F.R. Leavis. And James is fascinated not only by Leavis's grasp of literature, but unless you're thinking politically, you will miss the point. F.R. Leavis's scrutiny and scrutiny movement is an avatar in James's mind of what a small Marxist organization is about. James is attracted to scrutiny and to Leavis not only because of their ideas, but because they represent an analog of a small Marxist organization. These are the two great books of Leavis, and this book is published in 1952, the year before James arrived, so that when James comes in to Britain in 53, the moment of scrutiny, what Francis Mulhern calls the moment of scrutiny, is at its peak. Now, I am not projecting Leavis onto James. It's all over James's correspondence with his American comrades. This is what I saw years ago in the correspondence, that James has a preoccupation with Leavis. And I often wondered, how come nobody has picked up on this? James says, if you cannot get common pursuit, wire me. Read Leavis, particularly sociology and literature, but all over, bearing in mind my work on Shakespeare and the Elizabethan audience. I'm going on with the revision of the text. I send a spare copy of Leavis on criticism. Now, the same letter in which James tells them about the reaction of Constantine and Headley to his idea for a book on cricket is the same letter that James tells them, I'm going up to Cambridge to speak at the African Civilization Society, and when I'm in Cambridge, I'm meeting with Leavis. Now, this is very embarrassing. Last week, I had the letter in my hand that James wrote to Leavis, telling him that he's coming to Cambridge and asking for an appointment to meet him. And when I go to scan the letter to put it into the presentation, the letter has disappeared. Now, I'm embarrassed to tell you that because I can't understand how this thing has gotten misplaced. But in the letter, James tells him, I am sending you a copy of my book, Mariners, Renegades, and Castaways, and I would like you to review it in scrutiny. Now, on the one hand, you have James's deep and consistent involvement with the writing of Headley's book in 1953 to 1954. That's the rehearsal for the book eventually on West Indian cricket, the origin of cricket in Britain beyond the boundary. But just as important is James's involvement with F.R. Leavis and the scrutiny movement, because it is James's twinning, bringing together of the ideas of Leavis and sport that together trigger this fantastic insight into the game as a form of a kind of literary text, which requires the same care, close reading that you would give to a poem. Moreover, Leavis's notion of literature as a vocation, James carries over into his analysis of cricket as a vocation. Lewis's idea of the organic community also carries over in James's pursuit of a West Indian tradition. However, distinguishes C.L.R. James from Lewis, and these 2 points are very important. Lewis does not have a concept of the audience. James's insistence on the Elizabethan audience as the co-author with Shakespeare of the plays, and the role of the audience in sport is profoundly different from Lewis's idea of a minority culture, an elite culture of artists. Second point of distinction. Lewis is clear that modern culture is in steep decline. James does not disagree. But whereas Lewis thinks that the problem is the commercialization of culture, James says that's not the source of the problem. The problem is the bureaucratization of modern life. And you can get beyond the stranglehold of the Weberian trap of bureaucracy, and that will release new energies, which James feels is pent up inside of sport. Now, James writes a series of 6 detailed articles on George Headley called The Art of Batsmanship. These 6 essays on Headley and his art of batting are quintessential Lewisite texts. You get the point? The very conception that batting is an art that can be analyzed, observed, understood is a Lewisite trope. It's one of the rubrics, except that Lewis addresses it to literature. What James has done is corralled this Lewisite trope and made it now part of his optic for studying the art of batting. It is this audience beyond the boundary that Lewis doesn't admit into the confines of cultural criticism that distinguishes James from his avatar. Now, I just want to share with you, this is the final point. Grace Lee writes to James in December of 1953 when the letters are flowing fast and furious across the Atlantic. And this is what Grace Lee writes to him. Dear J, meaning Jimmy, as they knew him. His pseudonym was J.R. Johnson. Ever since last Thursday, I have wanted to write you on something that relates directly to the attached. James's letter beginning, I have done some 20,000 words on George Headley's book. On Thanksgiving, I went to a football game, a pro game, Briggs Stadium. 53,000 people, snow, rain, fog, cold. We sat behind one of the goals. The field is 100 yards long. What grew on me as I watched was this. With all of the distances, the snow, the rain, the fog, close to 50,000 people, no matter where they sat, could follow the action to the smallest detail. In the midst of the fast and furious action, with mud covering the numbers on the backs of the players, who have been described as looking as uniform spacemen in their helmets and padding, an ironic comment. They knew how many yards had been lost or won, who had made the tackle, who was carrying the ball as quickly as the other side, and the whole point, of course, is deception. No matter how far they were from the play, they knew the instant it took place, no matter how many people were piled up on the ball, before the result was flashed on the board and before the announcement could be made. If they had been right on top of the play, like the TV camera, they would not have known any sooner. Obviously, it wasn't just eyesight, not just one sense, nor was it just one individual. I am convinced that it was because it was a mass audience. They had knowledge of the plays, the strategy. They follow it in the sports accounts. They have played themselves. But it was more than knowledge. It was participation, feeling, complete participants rather than spectators. I sat there drawn into it myself, but not too much not to see that I was in the presence of something very important. Knowledge that was not intellectual because of total participation, total capacities that exist, but are completely untapped every day in the plant, that are completely modern. I kept thinking, if these capacities could be used in production, what miracles might not be performed? I wrote you about this some time ago in connection with a worker telling me that he knew, without seeing, about the meters of all different types coming down the line, while the supervisor, with electronic equipment, didn't know and shook with uncertainty all the time. This is a totally different kind of Marxism. This is a Marxism that relates total participation on the field of sport with life on the production line. Now, here is the irony. Alan Ross, reviewing Beyond the Boundary in June of 1963, writes, "But Mr. James's particular merits derive in the first place from his rewardingly close scrutiny of technique." And I think to myself, where have I seen that word before? Scrutiny. Here is the point. James, Levis, Headley. There is Beyond the Boundary. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robert. Maybe one or two people perhaps want to ask any kind of questions or make any immediate comments arising from anything Robert said. We can do that now.
Hi, Professor Ben Carrington, University of Texas at Austin. I wonder if you could just speak, maybe briefly, to the book that Stuart Hall writes in 1963 called The Popular Arts with Paddy Wannell. Mm-hmm. You mentioned at the beginning Stuart Hall and you kind of had his image and there were some obvious connections, but maybe if you could be a bit more explicit about the connections between the two.
I can't really discuss the book, but thank you for the question, and I would merely say this. In my conception, C.L.R. James is a Creole Levisite. In the same way that Stuart Hall is another Creole Levisite. These two brothers are tracking the same phenomenon, but as Creoles. Why are we so afraid of Creolizing these Europeans? The reason we have not seen the connection, though in the case of Stuart Hall, he's very explicit about his indebtedness to F.R. Leavis. But the reason we haven't seen Beyond the Boundary as a classic Levisite text in relationship to cricket, because we don't want to Creolize Leavis. We are still afraid of the results of Creolization. And until that is undone, we won't get it. But you're right. I mean, the book by Paddy Wannell and Stuart Hall are in the same Levisite tradition, but radicalizing the insights of Levis. Maybe we could talk in the intermission about this.
I just wonder to what extent you feel that the West Indies victory in 1950 gave James the impetus to write this book.
See, James is in America. James is cut off from the confluence of that great tour. When James returns in July of 1953, he misses the first of three West Indian tests in Britain. He's here for the second and the third. He watches the second at Old Trafford with George Headley. That's where he and Headley come back together. But I don't think the 1950 tour would have been influential. What made the 1957 tour particularly meaningful is that James, for the first time, is going to see a lot of the great West Indian players that he has heard about, like the three W's.
Congratulations, Bobby. This is brilliant. I just want to add a footnote speaking about the moment of this great work. And I read a letter from the Australian batsman who became a very famous journalist, Jack Fingleton. CLR had sent the manuscript to Fingleton in Australia. The manuscript up to the end of chapter 17.
Yes.
And early in '61, after Frank's great tour of Australia, an incredible reception he got, speaking of the people and the crowd and beyond the boundary and all of that, Fingleton was sending back the manuscript to say, I can't find a publisher for you, unfortunately. But this is a great work. But now you have a chance, because you have been vindicated. Worrell and his men have done a tremendous job within and beyond. And now you can finish this great work by including this because you have been vindicated.
Yes. And that's the final section of Beyond the Boundary.
That's the final section.
Which he adds while still in the West Indies.
Neil Washbourne, Leeds Metropolitan University. Could I pick up on the sort of aesthetic theory, at least as named in Beyond the Boundary, because he doesn't cite Leavis, does he? He cites Bernard Berenson.
Yes.
And clearly Berenson's model is more embodied, situated, tactile, and that raises the question of whether a more literary version of the text cannot do justice to a text which is so embodied and fleeting and so on. I wonder if you could say something about that, the kind of text that cricket is.
Yeah. I am puzzled by the lack of any recognition of Leavis in Beyond the Boundary, the absence of any formal acknowledgement. But the fact is, the methodology, the sensibility, Leavis is written all over that text. Now, is it possible for us to adduce the presence of Leavis without James's formal attribution? It seems to me that once you say Leavis, the thing becomes manifestly obvious. It's very obvious where this belongs. The problem is that the tide, the Leavis tide, had by 1960, 61, 63 receded. I feel that had Beyond the Boundary been published in the 1950s, it surely would have been recognized. And when Alan Ross uses unselfconsciously the term, the scrutiny of technique, you wonder, hello, how could he write that and it not have some resonance? We have, I think, done a grave disservice to this text by our failure to recognize the genealogy, the paternity of the ideas. You see, every two-bit writer can talk about James's Marxism and how very important Marx is to James, but how many can actually refer back to the influence of Leavis? It's not easy to do that, but you have to go to James's archive and read these disintegrating letters to see the frequency, the continuity of his mention of Leavis.
I'm still trying to absorb the relationship between James and Leavis, because the minute you say it, it is, of course, fantastically obvious, and yet I've never seen it, and many people haven't seen it at all. But I'm still absorbing that and having to think about it. I want to just ask you a question about James's letter to the American comrades in 1953 or 54, when he's explaining all the books he's got to write and articles he's got to write. And he says that he wants to rewrite Mariners for an English audience. What would that look like? I cannot imagine, unless actually it becomes Beyond the Boundary, you know. Instead of writing about Melville, he writes about cricket. But what did that entail? Have you any idea, Bobby?
Yeah, I have a good idea of what it entailed. When James arrived in July of 53, one of the first things he did was to go to meet his good friend and publisher, Frederick Warburg. And he writes a memorandum, carries it to Warburg, and he says, this is the program of my work. I want to publish a book called Preface to Criticism, which will pull together all of his ideas about literature and aesthetics. I want to rewrite my book on Melville for an English audience, and I want to write a book called The American Civilization. None of those things came to pass. They all fell by the wayside. But they were a gamble. The gamble was that to establish himself here in Caesar's land, he was going to represent himself to the cultural establishment in Britain, as a spokesman for the American Revolution. That was James's conception of himself. Certain things began to change that preoccupation with being a spokesperson for America, which is where Melville comes in. Number one, James's Marxist organization in America splits in 1955. The split with Freddie Forrest or Raya Dunayevskaya begins to reorient James, and so he's now preoccupied with a book on the vanguard, the destruction of the vanguard party. Secondly, Hungary. And thirdly, the independence of Ghana. In other words, this American orientation of 53, 54 becomes displaced by 56, 55, 56, and into 57, where James now begins to conceive of his role in a very different way with a different kind of audience. But Melville is a key component of his American attitudes in 53 and 54.